Next, we're going to be proving tangent of 75 degrees using half angles. So this will be our second example. Notice that 75 degrees is half of 150. Therefore, since 75 is half of 150, I can use the half angle formula to show what tangent of 75 degrees is. As with the first example for sine of 15, we're going to find theta. So theta will always be twice what the angle is you're starting with. Remember, if you double that angle, 75 for example, you get 150, which is your familiar angle. The familiar angle 150 is what we'll be using to figure out the unfamiliar angle of 75. And by familiar, I mean what will commonly show up on the unit circle, such as 150. Basically, all multiples of 30 show up on the unit circle and multiples of 45. And then 15 are the oddballs that sometimes show up. So any multiple of 15 we can prove using half angles. Step 2 is to write out the formula. Here is our formula for tangent of theta over 2. It's part of the formulas we learned for half angles. You could use either one. There's two different formulas for tangent. I'm going to use the one with sine of theta on the top and 1 plus cosine of theta on the bottom. Step 3 is to plug in theta. Now remember, the theta is not what you're trying to solve for. Theta is twice what you're trying to solve for, because when you plug that, when you double 75, you get 150. And part of the formula inside the parentheses is theta over 2, and we know that 150 degrees over 2 is 75 degrees, which is what we're trying to solve for. I'll even make a little note of that right here because some of my students get confused by that. Just remember, we're trying to solve for tangent of 75. Notice over here in the formula, we're also plugging in 150 degrees, the familiar angle. Think about it. I mean, we can't plug in 75 here because we don't know from the unit circle what sine of 75 is or cosine of 75, but we do know both of these at 150 since they are on the unit circle. Okay, so now all we have to do is simplify. We know what sine of 150 is on the unit circle. It's 1/2. We know what cosine of 150 is. It's negative square root of 3 over 2. Okay, so, and by the way, if you don't know that, go back and watch my lessons on the unit circle and you will be enlightened and see how easy it is to memorize the unit circle and those values. You need to know them like the back of your hand. So if you don't know that up until this point, make sure you go back and review that. Okay, so I plugged in 1/2 for sine of 150. I plugged in negative square root of 3 over 2 for cosine. Now all we have to do is simplify. And remember, this is part of step 4, which is to solve. Okay, so step 3, by the way, I don't know if I emphasized, is to plug in theta, the familiar angle. Okay. So the bottom we cannot combine until we write 1 as 2 over 2 so that these are the same denominator. So now we will have 1/2 divided by 2 minus the square root of 3 over 2. We're going to do keep, change, flip. We're going to keep the top, change the division and multiply, and flip the bottom. Now the 2's will cancel from the bottom left to the top right, and we have 1 over 2 minus the square root of 3. Next thing we want to do, since we want to get the radical out of the bottom of the denominator, is multiply the top and bottom by the conjugate. Now the conjugate of 2 minus the square root of 3 is the 2 plus the square root of 3. Since we multiply the bottom by that value, we want to multiply the top as well to be consistent. This, in effect, will, and by the way, I will use some parentheses here. Remember, when you multiply something by its conjugate, the two middle terms cancel and you're left with the first two terms plus the last two terms. Well, think about it. 2 times 2 is 4. Square root of 3 times the square root of 3 is 3. So you're just going to end up with 4 minus 3, which is 1 on the bottom, which is just insane. This is going to simplify rather nicely. Okay, so I'm showing that right here. This is the first term times the last term. And remember, that's what happens when you multiply something by its conjugate. You multiply the first terms and the last terms. And of course, a negative and a positive make a negative. So you get 2 times 2 minus the square root of 3 times the square root of 3. So you get 4 minus 3. Notice nothing happened to the top. It remained 2 plus the square root of 3, the original conjugate that I multiplied. So we get 2 plus the square root of 3 over 1, since 4 minus 3 is 1, and anything over 1 is itself. So we have just proven, ladies and gentlemen, that, whoops, I want you to be able to see this, tangent of 75 is even simpler than sine of 15 using half angle formulas. Final answer is 2 plus the square root of 3. Very, very simple. So something like 3.7, right? So there you have it, using a half angle to prove tangent of 75 degrees. That's all I'm going to say for this video. If you have any other questions about it, let me know.